All right. Hi, everyone. I recognize some names on there. So hello. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to get my screen share up here and we're going to see if it behaves today. It was just working. Amazing. Okay. So if you want to, and then Amanda, if you don't mind just keeping tabs on the chat, that would be great in case I
No
miss it.
problem.
Thank you. I'll see if I can just get it to pop out here as well. And then we shrink everyone. Okay, so I am going to kind of roll through. I've got several slides that I prepared, and today kind of our topic was really just coming up with an overall plan for approaching how to prepare for and plan for the ACT and the SAT. Obviously, kind of our junior year, going into senior year, major college entrance exams are on the horizon for a lot of you guys if you are here. So we're going to go over kind of some timeline questions, some tips, just a lot around the actual setting up for preparing for the test. And then I think we have scheduled in February, I want to say, another session on actually that we can bring in students and actually talk about strategies for preparing for the test. So we'll get real specific there. Just a little bit of background about me, if you have not met me before or attended anything that we've done. My background, my name is Lisa Marscano. My background is in executive functioning and neurodiversity, or just all of the different ways that individuals' brains kind of think, learn, and process information. So that, of course, comes into play when we're talking about standardized testing. And then I am a teacher by trade as well. So I have my master's in teaching, and I kind of just have been in this specialized field of executive functioning now, running my own business for almost 20 years at this point. So I've been working with ACT prep specifically, and then some SAT prep as well, for about 20 years or so at this point in time. So everything that I'm bringing to you, everything I do in my business and in my work life, I also work at a school district as well, running their student support programming. So everything I do is very focused on needing to be practical, needing to be realistic, and then trying to individualize as much as possible. I really firmly believe that there's not a cookie cutter or kind of one size fits all approach to any of this. Academics included. So I just want to make sure that when we're looking at ACT and SAT preparations and you're making choices as to how to prepare, that we're actually considering what's going to work best for that individual student or your particular situation. And we'll talk more about that in a little while. So I do specialize, like I said, in the executive functioning piece, which has to do with organization, time management, planning, but also how we manage our studies. So study skills, how we process and learn information, how we apply what we have learned, and all of that good stuff. Self-regulation is another key component of the executive functions. So our abilities to really be self-aware, understand how our brains work and what we need to do, and then how we regulate. And that, believe it or not, really does come into play pretty significantly when we're talking about ACT and SAT testing. I've been at this a long time. I've seen a whole lot. So if you have any questions at all, definitely please hang on to them until the end, or just throw them in the chat at any point. I really like to look at, for this particular piece, how each individual student's mind is working. So how is it that they need to receive the information? How do they need to think it through, or what do they need to tell themselves, or how do they need to see it or break it down in order to actually apply the strategy or the content correctly? We want to look at how they're managing their stress around the test, and in general, how they're actually managing themselves during the test. So they're just test taking, their mindset, kind of where they're at, how they're talking themselves through it so they can persevere, and we'll speak to that in a little while. How they're dealing with challenges. You know, a lot of kids will, and I'll try and keep it very specific to the test because I do this across all areas, but when we're talking about these tests, a lot of students kind of make up their own rules and feel like, oh, I'm not good at math, so I'm just going to do terrible on the math section. Or the math section for the ACT, for example, is 60 questions. They hit problem number 5 and it happens to be a little bit more challenging, and that throws their mindset off for the entire rest of the test. So there are a lot of other factors that come into play. You'll hear a lot about that this evening when we're talking about being successful on a test like this. So my contact information is on this slide. I was saying to Amanda, it was just one of those days. So I will clean up the slides and probably add a few additional FAQs to the end of those. So if you would like to get those slides, we'll send them out to those who registered. And then if you need to reach me for anything, my email address is there on this slide. So before we really jump into the details, I just want to kind of reiterate, we're going to go over the basics today, kind of the big picture. We'll do some FAQs cues that I put on the slides, and then any questions that you guys have that I can answer. If it's something that's kind of beyond my realm, I'll be the first one to say, hey, I'll look into it, or I'll try to get you a resource for that. We're going to go through specifics and strategies of the actual test content itself in a future session. Like I said, have done this for about 20 years. Everything you're hearing from me today is based on those 20 years of experience. So this is kind of what I'm sharing with you and what I've learned and what I've seen working with a very wide range of students with all different types of strengths and areas of opportunity. So we do have exceptions to every rule. So even though I am making a recommendation or drawing a conclusion, there's of course going to be an exception for every rule. And I want to just make sure we're looking at like the bigger picture and the general advice, but of course there's customization and tweaking that we can do. We will do the Q&A at the end, so jot down your questions. I do specialize in the test prep portion of this. So all of the information processing and application and content stuff that we're going to talk about, I do not specialize. So just to kind of clarify on the admissions process for college. So I kind of draw the line there. I help a lot with that test prep and how to be successful and how to manage yourself and how to, manage that content itself. But when it comes to the test administration, where to sign up, which schools offer it when, all of that stuff is done through the website and College Board for SAT. And then the ACT organization, they have really great resources on their websites for that. And then your local high school or your student's high school, if you're watching as a parent, can be very helpful as well. So I will point you in those directions if I can't answer a question, but anything and everything test prep, content strategy, mindset related is in my wheelhouse. So let's go ahead and jump in. I know that many of us are familiar with the tests. We're going to talk about both, just real kind of briefly overview of the SAT and the ACT. So we'll start with the SAT. Many of us, I know the times kind of depending on our years that we attended high school, it was a little bit more, or the region that you lived in, there was kind of variation in what test was taken by most students in that area oftentimes. So kind of when I was in high school, everyone was taking the ACT for the most part. It's kind of a mix right now, and we'll talk a little bit about which test to take, because really students do have a choice at the end of the day. So the SAT has had the current format. I know some of us remember it being out of 2,400 points. They've moved to a 1,600 scale again. So they were 1,600, 2,400, 1,600, I believe. Since 2016, they've been on a 1,600 scale again. They have changed the test since then. So we have three main sections of the test. There's a reading section, which is 52 questions, and the students have 65 minutes to complete that. The writing and language section is 44 questions, and it'll be 35 minutes they have to complete that. And then the math is 58 questions, and they'll have 80 minutes. The math isn't one long section. It's broken up. There's a calculator portion and there's a no calculator portion. And then there's also a multiple choice, kind of your regular Scantron fill in the blank. And then, I'm sorry, not fill in the blank, Scantron, multiple choice fill in the bubble. And then there's a fill in the blank, an actual like student free response. And I put a screenshot of that up in the upper right-hand corner, just so you can see for students what that looks like. This is unique to the SAT. The ACT does not have a section where you actually have to fill in and show your own work or do your own work to fill in your own answer. The ACT is all multiple choice, where there will be a set number of answer responses given to them. Let's see. Essays. So on the SAT, they do not any longer have an essay component. That is relatively new, I believe, as of last year. The only exception to that is that we have several states who still require the SAT, which I'll mention again at another point, but the SAT is required for state testing. So that's a mandatory test and it's required for graduation. So some states are still offering the essay, but for the most part, the SAT, you won't find it on their website. It's not an option to register for it on a national test date. Okay, so then I think we already spoke to this. 1,600 is the max score. They blend the English components together out of 800, and then 800 is half of that is coming from the math score as well. So that's kind of overview of the SAT. We're going to dig in come February. We're going to dig into the actual sections and what those look like and what the passages and the questions look like a little bit deeper. We're going to jump right now to ACT, so then we can talk about kind of the comparison between the two. So ACT itself. ACT has not changed for a very long period of time, unlike the SAT. The SAT has kind of bounced around with the number of sections it has and what the format looks like. The ACT has been pretty consistent for a significant, I would say, decades at this point in time. I want to say mid to late 80s, since there was a significant change. There are 4 main sections on the ACT: the English, the math, the reading, and the science. All the times and question numbers are listed on the screen. Both tests are relatively similar in length, about 3 hours, give or take. There is an essay option on the ACT. So when you register for the ACT, that you will be doing completely on your own. The ACT is not offered through the schools. It used to be. So I'm actually going to pause and speak to that for a minute, just because if you have older students, it's been a number of years now, but in April, there is a statewide testing day. And so if you have, obviously you may have noticed this, if you have juniors right now or sophomores, those students in April are having 2 days or 1 or 2, depending on the year, of testing in the public schools in the state of Illinois. It's kind of a statewide testing day, and they will take this year the SAT, and for the past several years now, the SAT. So it's offered by the state, and it's actually required for graduation, I believe, in most of the districts. I know it is in ours. So students have to take that SAT in school. It's mandatory. It used to be years ago that the state had a contract with the ACT. So gosh, I wish I had looked up the number of years now. It's been a while. But if you have kids who are older, the test that they took in school during the school day, so other grade levels, some grade levels get a day off in April. Some of them take PSAT or other testing, but juniors will take SAT. It used to be ACT. So this is where there comes to be a little point of confusion. I'm going to speak to it now just to kind of clarify, because I get this question all the time. So before I continue on ACT, I'm going to clarify with the state test in the schools. It's offered at the school. You don't have to pay for it, I believe. So the kids will automatically be signed up, which is great. And it's the SAT. So there's a lot of confusion because it's the state required test, because the state now has a contract with the SAT, with College Board, the SAT test to offer instead of the ACT. It was really just about who the state contracted with. It really has nothing to do with what colleges are looking at. So it's a big misconception with a lot of parents that because the state of Illinois offers the SAT and that's what's required in public schools for our statewide testing day, that everyone thinks, oh, well, the whole nation is going to SATs. All the colleges want SATs. That is not true. The majority, almost all colleges will accept either test, so ACT or SAT. If you are looking very specifically, certain East or West Coast schools, certain private schools, or maybe Ivy League, right? They're going to most likely prefer the SAT or require the SAT, but the majority of schools across the nation will accept ACT or SAT, and there are conversion charts. I didn't put any on here, but you can just Google ACT to SAT conversion. So if your student has a PSAT test score in the system from school, or you've gotten the report for that, you can actually convert the PSAT or look at the projected SAT score, and then you can convert that on a chart to the ACT just to get a ballpark, because the scores are so different. You know, they might have a 1120 on one test, and then they might end up having like a 24 on the other, and they have nothing to do with one another as far as the scales go. So I know that was a little bit of a sidebar, but I just feel like there are so many misconceptions, and I kind of been doing this for so long, consistently get the same questions. So I just like to clarify that. So ACT versus SAT, we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But the ACT itself does have an essay still. You will need to sign up for that. It'll just be on a Saturday. It's offered at various schools in the area, just depending on which ones are hosting it. We'll talk about the timing of when those are offered in just a minute as well. One point on the 4 sections, the science section is not an actual science section. So I want to just be very clear on that. And I can answer questions about some of the content if people have that towards the end. I just don't want to take up too much time on it now. The science section is more science reasoning. It actually used to be called science reasoning because they're really looking at the student's ability to analyze the data and answer questions. They are not asking the students to study and apply their scientific knowledge or to know science. The test used to have around 1 or 2 just straight science content questions. For example, you remember the photosynthesis formula or you don't. you know what a pedigree is or you don't. You can't really study for that portion of it. It's moved a little bit more in the direction of 3 or so questions that are science-based out of the 40. So just to be aware, there really isn't a way to study and prepare. Students should not be spending their time studying the topic or the content of science itself. The passages sometimes can be a little bit overwhelming. All of the time can be a little overwhelming to look at because they'll have to do with crazy physics and chemistry, earth science, all kinds of things that they don't necessarily even learn about in school. It's not about the science. It has everything to do with just reading the graphs and tables and interpreting the data and drawing conclusions and making predictions. So I just want to clear that up because I know a lot of students stress about that, as do parents as well. Okay, we talked about the essay, it's optional. At the end of the test, just so you know, if your student signs up for the ACT, I found this, I didn't mention, but I also have high school students. So I have, I have a freshman in college now, and then I have a junior at Downers North and I have a freshman at Downers North. So my kids are right in here now at this point, finally. I found that the ACT is constantly testing out their practice questions. I'm not sure if this is as true on the SAT because more students are choosing to take the ACT more frequently. But at the ACT, sometimes we would expect them to get out. Like I think I drove to pick up my son at 11:30 or something, thinking he'd be done by 11:30 or 12. And they held him after to pilot out test questions. So they'll say, okay, now you're going to sit for another 30 minutes or X amount of minutes. And then they're going to give them questions that don't count towards their ACT because they're trying to just test out the questions they're going to use on future tests. So I just like to throw that out there for you guys to warn the students about, or if you're watching as a student, so that you know you might be there a little bit longer testing out future test questions. Okay, we talked about the maximum score, I think for ACT is out of 36. This one works a little differently. They take out of the English, math, reading, and science, you get a 36 out of each one. And then they average the 4 together, just a straight up add all 4 together, divide by 4, and you get a number. They will round up. So if your average comes out to a 23.5, then you'll actually get a 24 as your overall composite, which is the average of all 4 scores. I am going to talk for a minute about super scoring. And let me move my window. In the upper right hand, I did another screenshot here. So the upper right hand corner of the slides, or of the slide here, you'll see an example. So a super score, some of you might very well know what that is, but if you don't, super score is if you take the test, if a student takes the test more than one time, they're going to take the highest score from each of the subject areas and average those together. I'm not sure if you guys can see my mouse on here, but test number 1, the student took they took the February test and they received 32, 33, 31. So their science, English, and reading, if you look straight down, those were the highest that they had gotten for those sections. But the October test that they took, they actually scored the best on math out of all 3 tests. So the ACT will pull, or the college will look at, the ACT actually does it for you, that 34 from the last test, and then they're going to keep the other 3 high scores and average those together. So it really helps out students when they're looking at that overall composite to be able to pull the highest subtest or subject test from each of the tests taken. And then we'll talk about how many times to take the test as well. But that's one benefit of taking it at least more than one time, because if there's one section or one subject that's pulling their score down, then it, with super scoring for the colleges that do that it can be very helpful to take the test again. They might do significantly better on that. Specifically, the reading and the science sections, the last 2 are very, I want to say they're more subjective. They're not subjective, but they're variable. So it's definitely kind of luck of the draw as to the content, the difficulty of the passages, how interesting they are. There's a lot more variability in scores on the reading and the science just across the board, as opposed to the math and the English, which tend to be a little bit more consistent. So, okay. So now let's just take a minute and talk about SAT versus ACT, because this is kind of that great debate. Which one should my student take? And I'll probably say this more than one time. Try not to get caught up in what everyone else is talking about. I know students are expressing that all of their friends and the people around them are talking about the tests and the preparation and the stress. I know parents right now are expressing that other parents are talking about the test, which test and which tutor, which program, and how often do I get it? And let's get started. I'm going to speak to that in just a minute as far as the timing goes. But as far as helping choose which test to take, things that you want to consider, because you do have a choice. first of all, if students have an idea of what college they want to go to, certainly look at what the requirements are going to be, because that will dictate which tests you need to take. The SAT itself is a little bit more math heavy. We talked about having that non-calculator and calculator portion, and then we talked about having kind of the free response portion. So that can be challenging for some students. And if math isn't a strength, that can be frustrating for them. So it's just something to think about. They don't have a science portion on the SAT, that reasoning component. They kind of build that into the reading comprehension, I think the reading comprehension section, where they're having you do some of that. They'll throw a graph or a data table into a reading passage so they can still assess that skill set. ACT itself, as we mentioned, hasn't changed as much. So it's just more consistent, which makes it a little bit more coachable. So if we're looking to say, okay, here's my starting point, and I know I really want to kind of push myself to score a little bit higher, it's typically students express that it's a little bit easier to do that with the ACT, but that's not to say that the SAT, we can't do it as well. It's just been more consistent over time. So it's easier to kind of get behind the way they write the questions and kind of figure out the system, as opposed to the SAT, which hasn't looked like this for all that long, realistically speaking. Oh, I didn't finish that. I'll get that typed in. Sorry. An overwhelming number of students prefer ACT for those reasons mentioned above. The test format is just preferable. It's all multiple choice for the most part, other than that math section on the SAT. But for the most part, when students try out one of each, typically their comparative scores, if you were to look at the conversion scales in the table, kind of come out to be the same. They're rarely very far off. However, students, and I'm going to go so far as to say 90 to 95% of the students that I've worked with anyhow, and that's been hundreds and hundreds, prefer the ACT over the SAT. There are students who just feel more confident on the SAT. Great. That's the test that they should be focusing on then. So it's very individualized, and it should definitely be kind of what that student is comfortable with and what they feel more confident taking. I would say choose one of the tests and prep really well for it. Any preparation you're doing for one is going to carry over to the other. Obviously, there are specific differences. There's a lot of specific things that we're coaching around for ACT just because of the way they write the questions, but those will transfer to the SAT as well. We talked about this already. The SAT is the one that's required in the public schools, and I believe for graduation at some, if not all schools. I'm not sure how every district does that. And then my recommendation on that when they're trying to choose is to just try one of each, or just print one or pull one up online and take a look at the format of the questions and the content that's on there and see which one the student feels more comfortable with. So unless there's some big reason, like a certain program or college is requiring one of those tests to be taken, there isn't any reason why a student should pick one over the other. It usually is going to be which one they're more comfortable with. Okay. We're going to jump into, I could talk about this stuff for 3 hours, so I'm keeping an eye on time. We'll jump into the dates just to see kind of when they're offered. For SAT, these are the standard dates kind of on a yearly basis. And then I'll talk about when to take these tests and what I recommend and what I kind of see students choosing. But right now, just so that you know, they're offered at various times of the year. I'm pretty sure these are all accurate. I'll triple check that. There's not a lot of overlap, or we should say it's like 50-50. But you'll notice for the ACT test, I don't have one in July. You may know of someone who took one in July. I didn't put it on there because it's offered at so few locations that most students can't get into it. I have had a couple students get in, so it's not a major test date, so I don't want someone to plan for that. And then for the SAT test, you'll see for April, I put a green burst around that one. That's because that's the state required one. And so that's the one that will be offered actually at school during the school day. So students will have a day off of school and they'll take the test. The rest of the ones in yellow, whether it's ACT or SAT, the student needs to go in, create their account through College Board for SAT. And I have the links for that at the end of the slide deck, or ACT.org for the ACT tests. They have deadlines associated. There's a late registration deadline. And then I will mention this here. I've got it in my other slides for some of the info sessions and offerings that I have that I'll share with you guys. But please make note of the date that you have to upload your ID. So students have to upload their ID or driver's license so that there's a photo ID on file, and it has to be done a certain number of days before they go into the exam. And I've had this happen to students before where they forgot to upload it. They will be turned away at the door and they will not be able to take the test if they have not updated or uploaded that ID. So just pay really close attention and put that in the calendar. because it's very disappointing when they study and prepare and then show up and can't take the test. I did kind of start to speak to this, and we'll talk about the timing in a minute. It's really important that students choose a timeline that works for them personally. Everyone has different factors kind of coming into play in their lives, different commitments, different preferences. So I want to make sure whatever type of a test prep plan they're choosing, it's going to be something that works for that individual student. Okay. I'm not seeing any chat questions. You can certainly feel free to jump in or just save them for the end. I'm good with that as well. Some big picture bullet points. You're lucky because I probably had 15 of these all typed out and I had a chance to transfer 3. I think the rest are pretty much covered on the slides or will come up in questions. So keep this kind of short and sweet. And I may say this again, I really want to stress the fact that this score, SAT, ACT, does not define a student. It should not define them. It's not a reflection of how smart they are or what their ability is. A lot of students just don't test well because of the skills required for standardized testing, or because of a stress level, or they're not feeling well that day, or the test was particularly difficult, or their brain just doesn't work in the way the test wants it to. Does not mean that they're not smart, capable, and that they don't have a ton of other valuable skill sets that are going to serve them really well in life. So I just like to always remind parents of that, and students too, because I think there becomes such a frenzy around the test with everyone talking about it and putting pressure on themselves or their students to do well, feeling like it's this most important thing in the world and it's going to make or break their future. I can tell you from all of my 20 plus years of experience, it does not. And I just know that I've seen it kind of unfold a multitude of different ways. It doesn't define who they are or how smart they are. It really is not a reflection of that. And I know when the scores don't come out where the student wants or where the parent wants, that can be difficult. Because let's face it, kids talk as much as I advise them to just not talk about it or to come up with some quick pat response. Generally, they don't feel good if they don't score well. And sometimes parents too get frustrated. So like, my kid is a 4.2 GPA. They're in all honors classes. They're doing so well. They're so smart. Yes, they are. But the score isn't always going to equate to that. Now, that being said, there's a lot we can do about it to get those scores to increase. So that's the good news. But, we're not likely to take a student from a 21, 22 up to a 31, 32. That's relatively unheard of. However, we can see kids improve a significant amount with the right kind of approach and preparation. So on this first bullet point, the skills that are required, this is why when we look at any kind of preparation, I want students to focus not just on content. Content is a piece of it. It's an important piece of it, but so much of it is really about assessing the data or the information or the passage, analyzing the types of questions that are being asked, adapting to that, to approaching the test a different way, to the way the questions are being worded, and then learning and applying old content and new content. So sometimes they're going to see something on these practice tests or when they're preparing that they just haven't seen before. So they'll need to learn that. And I generally advise them to do it, or we'll do a quick preview with them of that information if it's something that they can pick up pretty quickly. If it's some really advanced statistics concept that they've just recently been throwing on to the test, that the majority of students, like 98% of them probably, I'm making that number up, but a really large number of students by their junior year or even senior year have not taken a stats class. So the likelihood of them learning some complicated statistical calculation or formula is going to be a lot lower than so many of the other concepts that we can kind of just do an overview of. So sometimes there's a lot of new material that they'll see on the test that we can get the foundations for and get the foundational content for before they have to go and take that test again or take it for real. There's a lot of old content on there. So it's been a while since a lot of students have had to do least common denominator, adding and subtracting fractions, working with decimals, percentages. So these, geometry. So if they're a junior, depending on their math level, or a senior taking the test, they haven't had geometry for a while. If you're at a school with a curriculum that's a little more unique, sometimes that gets blended across multiple years. So we want to just brush up on all the geometry concepts because that throws a lot of students off. So there's a lot of old information from going way back to relatively recent in high school that they can learn and that we can brush up on to prepare. So they're going to need to do that content work as well. But more important, almost more important than that, is going to be those other pieces. How do they break down the questions? How are they actually managing their time on the test? A lot of students finish in time, but many of them struggle with 1 or 2 sections, getting through the reading or getting through the math. So we got to talk a lot about strategies and how to actually manage that time and make sure it doesn't interfere with their mindset as well. They kind of have to get behind the minds of the test writers. I always talk about that, and I've mentioned it before. I want them to be thinking not so much what's the grammar rule that I learned in English or 8th grade or whatever it was, 6th grade, but rather when the question is about commas on the ACT and they're giving me choices about where to place the comma, I need to know the rules that the test writers are using. And then that's what we teach them. And so they're going to call on the correct rules. So if the question says this, I'm going to do this, this, and this. We look at it that way for math as well. So we really want to train them to kind of give the test writers what they want and not to kind of fall back on old habits or old test taking strategies. So we're going to ask them to apply and follow these new strategies and rules. And then the perseverance I mentioned as well, and the mindset, so critical. The kids sometimes will be thrown off by small or big things the day of the test or during the practice. And if their mindset shifts, if their stress level spikes, if they're anxious at all, or significantly anxious, it's okay to be anxious a little. That can be healthy. But if they're at all thrown off by that or stressed out, that can completely interfere and completely block their ability to recall everything that they've learned and practiced. So having strategies for keeping themselves in a good mindset and for sticking through when it gets harder, it feels hard or hopeless, is going to be a critical part of them actually performing successfully on the test. There is not a right or wrong way to prep for this test or to approach your prep. It's going to be different for every student. I will say, I think it's on another slide, an FAQ maybe, or a FAQ slide. There is a point of over preparing and overkill. And I've seen that over the course of time. The majority of students who over prepare or who are just consistently drive for extended periods of time in pushing themselves to focus on test prep without a break tend to either plateau or what's the word? I want to say kind of just hit a wall or hit a roadblock and start to shut down. So I just want to say to be kind of careful. It's really healthy to work breaks into the test prep process. I put in the last bullet, of course, again, like avoid listening to other parents talking about, what they're doing or their students doing. Students avoid other students and what they're talking about and what they're doing to prep. You've got to find a fit that's right for you. I have some students, some, not a lot, who just need a couple of sessions. They'll do some practice, they'll analyze their results, they'll have a few content questions. They need some strategy and approach, obviously, to kind of get behind the minds of the writers. And they do a couple sessions and they're great. And I have other students who are going to need work in all of these areas, and that just takes a longer period of time. So you kind of have to kind of watch it and monitor it as you go, and then make those adjustments. And especially avoid operating and making choices out of fear of not doing well, or fear of not doing what other people are doing, or that other people are preparing more or better. Just because it's different does not necessarily mean that it's better. Okay. I'm still kind of keeping an eye on the chat, so I'm not seeing anything pop up yet. Hopefully all this stuff is kind of relevant and informative. Those of you who know me know that I can just keep talking. So I will, because that's why you're here. Let's go through some Q&A. I just threw together, and apologies for typos, I'll clean this up. Hopefully there's none in there. I threw together some of the most common questions that I get that weren't already addressed in previous slides. So big question. When should my student take their first test? So this, let me see if this is going to let me go back. Yes. Okay. So general advice would be take that first actual test after the first of the year, after January 1st of junior year. Some students really want to take it in the fall, the October or the December tests. That's fine if they want to. I never discourage any plan that a student makes or kind of their intentions, but I would not push them to take it that early for multiple reasons. I just don't think it's necessary. You can see on the graphic here how many other opportunities they have to test. And then if you kind of circle back around on this slide, you'll see that senior year, we kind of just repeat the process. This is kind of based on a school year. Senior year, they can still take those tests again as well. So they can take the August SAT and the September ACT and get those scores back in time for college application deadlines, which typically are November 1st, just depending on, like the early action ones, typically November 1st. Obviously, there are some exceptions to that. So those would be generally the earliest times the apps are due. So you can get that September score back in time. October is middle of the month, so generally it does not come back before the application needs to be submitted, but you can resubmit it after the fact. So if you look there, kind of from August through September of senior year, there's another opportunity to take the test. In addition to, if we back it up and look, and we even say start taking junior year, the February and March tests, then we have 3 more opportunities junior year for SAT, 2 more opportunities for ACT, unless you get into the elusive July one. You've got to, and then the senior year, there's 1 more chance of each. So there's a lot of opportunities to take the test. I generally do not advise taking more than 3. Again, exceptions to the rule, but that's been my experience that once we kind of get past that point of 3 tests, there's not a lot of change in the score. And I don't want to say we're at where we're at, because I've had students go and take that 4th one, and all of a sudden they do get that 1 subtest to pop up. So their super score comes up, but it's just not as common. I mean, generally 3 is kind of the recommended max. I have kids who take 4 and 5 of the tests, the official ones. So let's see, let me go back here. So timing of it, I advise winter, after winter break of junior year as a starting point to kind of work from. The February and March tests, they're great. If they want to give it a shot, they want a baseline, absolutely they can go for it. But really the bigger, most common ones are going to be let me go back to, there we go. The most popular or common test, kind of the traditional ones, I think that in my generation anyways, that we were used to, was that big April test for ACT and the big May test for SAT. So those are certainly great ones to shoot for, because then you still have 2 more opportunities to take each one at least after that point in time. But if they want to go ahead and jump in and do the test in January, February, that's fine as well. I shouldn't say January, February, March would be the ones that we'd want to recommend. So that's kind of my general rule of thumb on that. Another reason for that, and I know that a lot of people have kind of heard this as some of the talk, the majority of students don't have enough math to have, if you're in a really, really accelerated math program, they might have enough math, but a lot of typical juniors, whether you're doing honors level or regular level, they just need more of the math under their belts. The further along they get in junior year, the more likely they are to have a lot of those skills that they need to be able to be successful on the math test. So that's just one more reason for considering changing it. So if you know of people who are starting to take the test really early, or they're taking it sophomore year, or they're, that's not necessarily, I should say not necessary. I don't ever discourage kids from taking it if they want to give it a shot. But again, I think it's more valuable to wait and take it a little bit later. So I hope that helps. When should we start preparing? So another big question mark, and you kind of got my take on preparation. It needs to be very specific to the individual, to your schedules, to your circumstances, to what the student can handle, how motivated or interested they are. That's not to say if they're not motivated, you shouldn't have them prep, of course, but the more motivated they are, the more likely they're going to follow through on the prep. So lots of different things to consider. If they're overloaded with classes and work and sports, let's try to be realistic around the timing of that preparation. So I always ask students, I went to do a graphic on this, when they do their prep, to plan it far enough ahead of time that they've got the time to kind of get through each of the content areas, get through kind of the lay of the land, the overview of the test, get through practice and analysis, and build up their repertoire. And then take a little break, and then gear up right before the test to kind of review everything and maybe, get another round of practice in. That's kind of my general rule of thumb for what helps most students to feel successful. They get that mental break so that they feel like they can kind of just process the information or put it out of their head for a little while, take a rest, and then come back to it fresh. I already mentioned that there can be a point of overkill, which is why I like to have breaks kind of planned in. So for example, if we have a student who's taking the April test, certainly they can start to play around with some practice tests in the fall if they want to. It's fine if they start in January or February. I've got students who just don't start prepping until a month or 2 before. And as long as they have a good plan, they get through the content, they get through the strategies, they do just fine. So there's, we can kind of do it a number of ways. I don't advise that they start summer or fall, like summer after sophomore year or fall of junior year, and do every single week, week in and week out, 1 or 2 times a week. Like it just gets to be a point of excess and burnout. So I definitely would recommend, if we're going to do several weeks in a row, that's great because sometimes it's necessary, but that we do it more in spurts where we're very focused and it's more intensive, and then we pull back and take a break. So that's kind of what we've found to be the most successful and the least stressful for students also. Let's see, what else did I want to say about when to start getting ready? I think I pretty much explained all of that. If kids want to do prep in the summer, I used to kind of say no, but now I realize the value with everyone's busy schedules in building up a little bit of a foundational skill set in both getting to know the test, getting exposure to it, doing a little practice, and then also doing some preview and review of material. So there's a lot of the old school review that we can go back to and make study guides on. They can file it away for future tests. And then previewing, like I had talked about, some of the content and the things that we know are going to be on the horizon when they see that test. And then they take their notes, I make notes, or whoever they're working with, or whatever program or platform they find, save it, and then just pick those back up as it gets closer to the test, and we kind of map out what that timeline needs to look like. Okay, more FAQs, and then we can open it up to questions. Let's see. Does the score really matter? Loaded questions. So yes and no. I'm going to start with the no. I will say all students are going to find a good fit if they decide to go on to college. I've seen this happen countless times. Some students score at or above where they wanted. Some don't land where they wanted or where they thought originally when they started they were going to end up. No matter how much prep and work they did and how much progress they made, it just wasn't where they wanted to be. I will tell you that all of those students found a school that was a great fit for them. So just keep that in mind as we're kind of looking at colleges. I know some students and or parents have kind of their heart set on a certain school, which requires a certain number. You know, it does matter. Of course, the colleges will use that for admissions. But beyond the admissions piece of it, and then the academic scholarship stuff, which we'll talk about in a sec, down the road, the score doesn't matter. I have kids who have, put a significant amount of time and energy into prepping, and they really wanted to push into the 30s. They needed to get that score up. And then some of them got there, and then they ended up choosing a school that maybe the score requirement was like a 22, and they were extremely happy with that. So, just because we're pushing for the score, yes, that gave more options, but at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that those schools are the best fit. So the students will end up being happy with whatever their choice is. So I just advise students always to keep that in the backs of their minds, and parents as well. Nobody ever talks about, I guess it could come up, but really, once you get on and you get into your college, the ACT score is out the window. And I've seen this again and again. Parents and kids, everyone is stressed. The score comes out, but as soon as the acceptance letters come back and the college is chosen, there's never a discussion about it again. It kind of just goes away. Their future employer is not going to ask what their ACT or their SAT score was. So just so that you kind of keep that as kind of a perspective piece there. I just always like to speak to that a little bit. Some schools are test optional, which I have in another FAQ. So we'll talk about that quickly in a sec. Even though I don't do a lot with admissions, I'll speak to that. And then I'll speak to this piece where I say, yes, the score matters because of course they are using it for admissions still at many schools. So it does matter in some regards, but they look at a lot of other factors too. A lot of it is just kind of what kind of makeup the university or the college wants for that particular school year, or what type of student or profile they're looking for, or what type of major or school they're applying to, or college within the university. Or it could just be their extracurriculars or their leadership roles or their other skill sets. So there's a lot of other things that come into play, of course. And then it does matter now more than it used to back in the day when I was in high school anyways, academic scholarships. So some of you, I'm sure all of you have heard of this. We sent our first one to college this year, so kind of figuring this all out was new to me. I pulled the one from Kentucky because my son's at the University of Kentucky, and so I had quick access to this. But usually you can search it up or call and find out. They do a combination at a lot of schools. Some schools give none, so this is important research to do, based on ACT or SAT score and their GPA. And then that dictates the amount of scholarship or money that they get off of their tuition each year. So you can kind of look at, a lot of them will put out charts, or they'll have somewhere a list, or they'll give you an idea of what that number needs to be. I'm not sure if all schools actually release it. That's kind of beyond my area of expertise, but it's definitely worth looking into. And then make sure that you're aware of whether they consider the weighted or the unweighted GPA, whether they're counting that or not, because it does make a difference. Because one of them can put you in a range here, but then if we're looking at unweighted, it's going to put you into a different range for that scholarship qualification. And then typically once those are put into place, there are all kinds of scholarships. These are just more the standard grade and GPA based and score based scholarships that they offer. So this is why for, I think, a lot of people, it's an added stress on the test or an added pressure for kids to do well, because it does end up saving money off of tuition. So it's great, except for the fact that the score is not always entirely within our control, right? So I just like to kind of answer that pretty honestly, but at the end of the day, whatever the score comes out to be is going to be okay. So kind of another question I get is, what if they score really low? I have so many students who are very strong students, very bright, but don't score that well. Please don't be concerned with that. I know I don't mean to lecture. I mentioned it a few different times. It just comes up and it can be a significant source of stress for students and parents. A lot of kids will score low and then they'll improve a boatload significantly throughout their test prep. Some of them will kind of hover. Most of them do improve. We have a lot of students who come up kind of like 1 to 4 points, 1 to 5 points. Had students come up 6 or 7. That's a lot more rare. But it really just depends on all of those other factors that we talked about when it comes to the skills needed to master a test like this. So I have students who don't do that well in school who ace this test because their brain just works that way, or we've trained their brain to work that way, and then there they go. So there's a lot to be done, which is the upside. And we already talked about kind of no matter where the score lands, please just remember it's not an indication of how smart they are. I know kids who struggle with school, who have learning disabilities or dyslexia or ADHD or other things that, sometimes make school a little bit more challenging, but that doesn't mean that they don't have strengths and skills in ways that other kids don't, or they excel in a particular skill set or area, and they're going to be just fine in life, but maybe they're not good standardized test takers for a variety of reasons. So just all of that kind of keep in the back of your minds if that is something of concern. I kind of spoke to this a little bit. A lot of times we see students jump up 2 to 5 points in that composite. The reading and the science, like I said, are the 2 more variable ones. The math and the English are more content based. Absolutely strategy based, especially for the English. It's not uncommon for me to see students in our work jump up, 6 or 8 points on the English section alone over the course of just 1 or 2 practice tests. It's not a guarantee. It's just not uncommon to see 4.5 point jumps or 8-point jumps over the course of a few practice tests. So lots of stuff that we can do, which is, I think, one of the upsides of doing some kind of preparation and kind of teaching students how to learn how to take that test and how to take the notes and do the analysis for themselves. There are a lot of factors that come into play when it comes to their ability to improve their scores too. We've talked about, I think, most of these. What's their stress level like? How do they feel that day? How hard is that test? There are ACTs or sections or passages that are just flat out harder than others. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of it. Did they actually apply the strategies, or did they fall back into old mindsets and old habits when they took the test? Did they space out, or could they actually remember all the rules or all the actual content when they were taking the test? So lots of different things come into play on test day and that influence their score kind of in the end. All right, I'm going to talk for a couple more minutes. Hopefully I don't have much left here, and then I can answer questions anybody has. Test optional. So a lot of schools are test optional. A lot of them went test optional during COVID. Some remain test optional where they don't want to test score. I'm going to quote this wrong because I don't do admissions. Oh, no, that was for something different. Some schools will actually say, please don't send us a score. And if they say, please don't send us a score, don't send them a score. It will actually count against you. This is what I've heard, again, not my area of expertise, but follow what that university or college wants. If they say test optional, do a little more digging. A lot of them state that they're test optional, but remember, they might actually use that score for other purposes. They might use it to determine the amount of academic scholarship money. So there is value in taking the test. If you have a school and your students' top school or 2 schools are test optional and they're truly test optional, they don't need to take the test. I know several students who just have chosen not to take the test, and because they did not need it for the college that they were attending. They will still, if they're at a public school, have to take the mandated SAT in April, but they don't have to take additional tests if they don't want to. How can you support your students if you're watching as a parent? Obviously a lot of different ways, but just making sure you're offering options and resources. I have links to the ACT and the SAT websites in one of my slides at the end. I also have the link to the practice tests as well. So SAT publishes 7 or 8 full practice tests with answer keys. The ACT publishes 1. But I put a link to the book that I use for test prep. It's actually holding up my computer right now, or I'd hold it up. It's a red book. To you guys here, I think it's actually, they change it sometimes. It's called the official ACT prep book. What I would strongly recommend is, if you're purchasing something for your student, or if you're a student purchasing a book to prep with and you're using practice tests, use one that's written by the writers of the test, or an old test. So if you're going to College Board and you want practice SATs, use their tests online. There's 7 or 8 of them. If you're prepping for the ACT, use the one online. I use that one when we do practice tests. And then the book, I think, has now 6. The red book has 6 full practice tests. And then it's got a section with tips and strategies, but we usually kind of customize those on our own. So if you're doing any kind of prep, or if you're a parent wanting to help buy some resources for your student, or just use the free ones that they have published on their websites, make sure that it's from the actual test company, or it's an old version or an old test. As a parent, we talked about this, let go of the fear. No matter what the score comes out to be, it's really more about just learning those other skills that are needed to do well on the test. If they learn those skills, my focus always is, how are these going to transfer when they get on into college? How are they going to transfer to their academics right now? How are they going to transfer to life, to dealing with hard things, to giving people what they want, which in reality is got to happen a lot of the time in most professions. So try not to push too hard. Listen to what the student wants. So if you're watching this as a parent, listen to them. If they're pushing back, I mean, obviously you want to encourage them to do some kind of preparation if that's meaningful for the decisions you guys are making, but don't push too hard, or panic too much, and try to be as supportive as possible. And those are just reminders sometimes I need for myself, so throw them in there. Best ways to prep. Like I said, there's no one right way. There's the books, there's practice tests, there's online lessons. Khan Academy has some resources. The websites themselves, I think both websites, you can actually sign up to receive questions of the day and do some online practice, like digital questions. You can do in-person tutoring. Some of the schools, a lot of schools offer some kind of a test prep, or at least you can check in with the college or counseling or career center and see if they have anything. Other workshops. I love workshops. I didn't used to do them because everything's so individualized, but I started playing around with those in the last few years, and we got a lot of success around the universal strategies and content that everyone needs to hear. And it's just the down and dirty. This is the kind of question you're going to see. Here's the strategy you want to use. Okay, this is the mindset you need to have going into this. So workshops can be great for that, but I always would say to supplement that with individual work, whether that's just the student on their own. Take the test, practice it. But the other piece is, if they're doing practice tests, making sure that they're checking their answers, of course, and then looking at the answer explanations if those are offered. I know that the book does offer those, in the official ACT prep book does, where they explain each answer. For the math, it's really helpful because you can see how the work was done. And a lot of students, that's all they need to be able to learn. They can analyze their own tests and look for patterns like, oh, I missed all the ones with commas. I better brush up on commas. So there's a lot they can do on their own if they don't have the time or resources to go out and, do private tutoring or workshops or classes. So there's lots of different levels and ways that you can prepare. If you have specific questions, I am happy to answer those. Wrapping up with my magic formula, we've talked at length about all of these. It's got to be a blended approach, specific to the individual. We got to focus on content, categorizing the questions, managing the test, using the right strategies, and not just big picture test strategy, but very specific to the types of questions and the types of content and subtests that are on these exams. And then that mindset and perspective and kind of self-management piece that goes along with being successful during the test taking. So we do test taking strategies as well. This slide in here has helpful links. So like I mentioned, it's got the SAT dates and deadlines, practice test link, the ACT registration information, the practice test link, and then the link to the book on Amazon that I always use for test prep because it's got 6 practice tests in it. So that's the main reason why I use it. I think that the last link is live. I am going to be hosting some sessions. I'll probably do some free informational sessions just to answer a lot of questions that we went over today and kind of talk about coming up with a plan for preparing for students. And then I'll offer some workshops and some different things as well. So if you want to, you can just bookmark that. I will say it's a draft right now, so just keep that in mind. I just have the major exam dates and the holiday weekends in there, and then I'm going to kind of pop up the tests as we go and as we get more into the heavier part of test season. So if, you know, student want to attend a workshop or whatnot, it's all just going to be listed on there. I think that's all I had for you guys. That was a lot of me talking, and it always goes by so very fast. Okay, so I'm good for questions. Amanda, I didn't see anything in the chat, so you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, and I'll also promote some of our library resources that we have. We do offer practice tests. We try to do them where they line up a couple of weeks before the real test, just as a, you know, last practice. It's more simulated than, so we have a librarian who is proctoring the test for the students. So it's sort of more of a real world experience. We also have lots of test prep books here that you can come check out. I would have to double check, but I'm sure we have the one that Lisa mentioned. So we have a whole test prep section. Those books I'll check out for 3 weeks. We also have a database called BrainFuse that you can access with your library card, and that has some training and practice tests in there as well. They're not from the people who make the tests, but if you're looking for some additional resources, that's a good one too. So, all right, well, if we don't have any questions, we will wrap up and we'll send out everything. And Lisa, your information is on the slideshow. So if anyone wants to reach out, if you come up with a question after the fact.
Yep.
All right.
Absolutely. No, thanks
you
everyone.
so much, Lisa.
Sounds good. Thanks. Have a good night.